They called it the only thing that ever really frightened me during the whole war. And those words came from Winston Churchill himself, a man who had faced down empires and stood defiant through the Blitz. He wasn't speaking of the Luftwaffe's bombs raining on London, nor the panzer divisions rolling across Europe. He was speaking of the Battle of the Atlantic and the desperate struggle of merchant sailors who fought not for glory or medals, but simply to keep Britain alive. The Atlantic Ocean during World War II became the world's deadliest workplace. Across those cold, gray waters, thousands of merchant ships formed convoys that stretched from horizon to horizon, carrying the fuel, food, ammunition, and raw materials that would determine whether democracies survived or fell to fascism. These were not warships bristling with guns. They were cargo vessels, tankers, and freighters. Slow, vulnerable, and crewed by civilians who knew that every voyage might be their last. The men who sailed them were not soldiers, yet they fought a battle as crucial as any fought on land. This is their story, a story of silent courage in the face of invisible death. When war erupted in September 1939, Britain faced an existential crisis that had nothing to do with military defeats. The island nation imported nearly two-thirds of its food and virtually all of its oil. Without a constant flow of supplies across the Atlantic from North America, Britain would starve, its factories would fall silent, and its resistance would crumble. Adolf Hitler understood this vulnerability perfectly. From the first day of the war, his U-boats began hunting Allied merchant ships, seeking to sever the maritime lifeline and force Britain into submission without ever landing a single German soldier on British soil. The men who crewed the merchant vessels came from every corner of the globe. British sailors worked alongside Americans, Canadians, Norwegians, Dutch, Indians, Chinese, West Africans, and dozens of other nationalities. Many were teenagers on their first voyage. Others were veterans of the Great War who had returned to sea despite knowing the dangers. They were engineers who kept aging engines running through Arctic storms, radio operators who tapped out desperate distress signals, gunners who manned defensive weapons with minimal training, and cooks who somehow prepared meals in galleys that pitched 40 degrees in mountainous seas. They received no uniforms, no military training, and, for most of the war, precious little recognition for the lethal work they performed. The convoy system itself was born from bitter lessons learned in the First World War. Individual ships sailing alone were easy prey for submarines. But by grouping dozens of merchant vessels together and surrounding them with naval escorts, destroyers, corvettes, and frigates, the Allies could provide protection while maximizing the number of ships that reached ports safely. A typical convoy might consist of 50 to 60 merchant ships arranged in columns, plodding across the Atlantic at the speed of the slowest vessel, usually no more than 8 or 9 knots. The journey from North America to Britain could take 2 weeks or more, 2 weeks of constant tension, where every sunrise brought relief at having survived another night, and every sunset brought dread of the darkness to come. Life aboard a convoy merchant ship tested human endurance in ways few landlubbers could imagine. The North Atlantic is among the most unforgiving bodies of water on Earth. Winter storms generated waves as tall as office buildings that could snap a ship in half. Fog reduced visibility to mere feet, creating a constant risk of collision within the tightly packed convoy. Ice formed on decks and superstructures, sometimes accumulating so heavily that ships became top-heavy and capsized. Inside the vessels, conditions ranged from uncomfortable to unbearable. Merchant ships lacked the amenities of passenger liners. Crews slept in cramped quarters where dampness was constant, where mold grew on walls and clothing, where the smell of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies became the permanent atmosphere. They worked 4-hour watches around the clock, never getting more than a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. And always there was the fear. Unlike soldiers who could see their enemy and fight back, merchant sailors faced an invisible threat that could strike without warning from beneath the waves. A U-boat might stalk a convoy for hours or even days, studying its patterns, selecting its targets. The first indication of attack often came as a thunderous explosion when a torpedo struck a ship hundreds of yards away. In the darkness, men would see a flash of light, feel the shock wave through the water, hear the terrible sounds of a ship dying, the shriek of tearing metal, the roar of escaping steam, the rumble of a boiler explosion. Then came the even more terrible sounds of men in the water, crying for help in the freezing sea.
The torpedoing of a merchant ship was not a clean or quick death. When a torpedo struck, it could detonate in the engine room, killing the engineering crew instantly. It could rupture fuel tanks, spilling burning oil across the water. It could blow open cargo holds, causing a ship to sink in minutes or even seconds. Crew members had to make split-second decisions with no training for such catastrophic emergencies. Should they try to launch lifeboats in mountainous seas? Should they jump into water so cold it could kill in 15 minutes? Should they stay aboard a sinking vessel and hope for rescue? There were no good options, only terrible choices made in darkness and chaos. The fortunate survivors who made it into lifeboats faced an ordeal that tested the limits of human survival. Merchant ship lifeboats were open boats, offering no protection from the elements. Men sat in water that sloshed in the bottom, their clothes soaked, their bodies losing heat rapidly. Hypothermia claimed many who had survived the initial sinking. Others died of exposure over days or weeks adrift as lifeboats drifted far off shipping lanes. Some boats were found weeks later with dead men still at the oars, frozen in position. The unlucky ones were never found at all, lost in the vastness of the ocean. Yet the merchant sailors kept sailing. After being torpedoed, after watching their shipmates die, after spending days in lifeboats or clinging to wreckage, survivors would receive medical treatment, a few days of shore leave, and then most would sign on for another ship, another convoy, another voyage into danger. This wasn't patriotic fervor or love of adventure. For many, it was simple economics. Merchant seamen needed to work to support their families. For others, it was stubborn determination not to let fear win. And for some, it was a quiet understanding that their work mattered, that every ton of cargo delivered was a blow against tyranny. The U-boats themselves were technological marvels and maritime coffins in equal measure. German submarines operated far from their bases, enduring their own hardships. Crews of 40 to 50 men lived in conditions even more cramped than merchant ships, surrounded by machinery, breathing air contaminated with diesel fumes and unwashed bodies, unable to bathe for weeks at a time, eating canned and preserved food, never knowing if the next depth charge would crack their hull like an eggshell. Yet German submariners were volunteers, driven by a sense of elite status and effective propaganda. They hunted Allied shipping with deadly efficiency, particularly in the early war years when they enjoyed what they called the happy time, a period when U-boats operated virtually unopposed, sinking merchant ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. The statistics from those dark months tell a grim story. In 1940 and 1941, German U-boats sent millions of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom. Each sunken ship represented not just lost cargo, but lost lives. Merchant Navy casualties were proportionally higher than almost any other service. Of approximately 185,000 men who served in the British Merchant Navy during World War II, over 32,000 died, a casualty rate of about 17%. For comparison, British Army casualties were roughly 10%. These were civilians facing military dangers, yet they received none of the support structures that military personnel could access. The turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic came gradually through a combination of technological innovation, tactical adaptation, and sheer determination. The Allies developed better convoy tactics, with escort carriers providing air cover in the mid-Atlantic gap, where land-based aircraft couldn't reach. Improved radar and sonar made U-boats easier to detect. The breaking of German naval codes allowed convoys to be routed around wolf packs of submarines. Long-range aircraft and escort ships became more numerous and more effective. By 1943, the tide had turned. U-boats that had once hunted with impunity now became the hunted, suffering catastrophic losses as Allied anti-submarine warfare improved dramatically. But even as the strategic situation improved, individual convoys continued to face desperate battles. The story of convoy ONS-5 in April and May 1943 illustrates the brutal nature of these encounters. 43 merchant ships, escorted by a handful of warships, plowed through storms so violent that several ships sustained serious damage. Then, as the weather cleared, over 40 U-boats descended on the convoy. For 4 days and 4 nights, the battle raged. 13 merchant ships were sunk, taking their crews and cargoes to the bottom. But the escort forces fought back with unprecedented ferocity, sinking 6 U-boats and damaging several others so badly they had to withdraw. The Germans lost more submarines in that battle than the Allies lost merchant ships, a significant milestone. After ONS-5, German Admiral Karl Donitz temporarily withdrew his U-boats from the North Atlantic, acknowledging that the tide had turned.
Yet the merchant sailors didn't celebrate victory. They simply continued doing what they had always done: loading cargo, sailing into danger, delivering the goods. Every ship that reached port represented countless tons of war material that would equip armies, fuel aircraft, and feed civilians. A single tanker might carry enough fuel oil to keep hundreds of aircraft flying for months. A freighter loaded with grain might prevent famine in Britain during a difficult winter. The cargo of tanks, trucks, and ammunition formed the backbone of the liberation forces that would eventually invade Nazi-occupied Europe. The Russian convoys added another dimension of horror to the merchant sailors' experience. Convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk in the Soviet Union faced not just U-boats, but also German surface ships, bombers based in occupied Norway, and the most brutal weather conditions imaginable. In summer, convoys sailed in continuous daylight, exposed to constant air attack. In winter, darkness provided cover from aircraft, but temperatures plunged far below zero. Ice accumulated dangerously on ships, and storms of apocalyptic proportions threatened to overwhelm any vessel. Convoy PQ-17 in July 1942 became one of the war's greatest maritime disasters when faulty intelligence caused the convoy to scatter. Without the protection of grouped ships and escorts, German forces hunted down individual vessels, sinking 24 of the 33 merchant ships. More than 400 men died, and 3,350 vehicles, 430 tanks, and over 200 aircraft went to the bottom. Military equipment desperately needed by the Soviet Union. As the war progressed and Allied fortunes improved, merchant sailors continued their dangerous work, now supporting invasion forces. The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, required an enormous merchant fleet to transport troops, vehicles, and supplies across the English Channel. In the months following the invasion, merchant ships formed a continuous bridge between Britain and France, delivering everything an advancing army needed. They faced mines, coastal artillery, and occasional U-boat attacks in shallow waters where submarines were especially dangerous. The liberation of Europe could not have happened without these civilian sailors and their vessels. Even after Germany surrendered in May 1945, merchant sailors continued dying. Mines laid during the war years remained a threat for months and years afterward. Ships struck mines and sank in supposedly safe waters, killing crews who thought they had survived the war. The war against Japan continued until August 1945, with merchant ships supporting operations in the Pacific, facing kamikaze attacks and enduring tropical conditions as brutal in their own way as the North Atlantic. When peace finally came, merchant sailors returned to port expecting recognition and gratitude. What many found instead was indifference. Unlike military veterans who received medals, pensions, and public honors, merchant seamen were simply paid off and sent home. They had been employees of shipping companies, not members of the armed forces, and therefore received minimal benefits. For decades after the war, their contributions were largely forgotten, overshadowed by more dramatic military campaigns. The men who had kept Britain alive, who had made victory possible through their courage and sacrifice, faded into obscurity. Only in recent decades has recognition finally come. Memorials to merchant seamen have been erected in Liverpool, London, Cardiff, and other maritime cities. The British government eventually awarded campaign medals to merchant navy veterans, though many had died before receiving this belated recognition. Historians have begun telling their stories, ensuring that future generations understand the debt owed to these civilian heroes. The legacy of the Atlantic merchant ships extends far beyond World War II. The convoy system and the lessons learned about logistics and supply chains have influenced military doctrine ever since. The courage of civilian seafarers in time of war established a tradition that continues today, with merchant sailors operating in dangerous waters during conflicts around the globe. The Battle of the Atlantic demonstrated that wars are not won solely by armies and air forces, but by the unglamorous work of supplying those forces, work performed by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Standing today on the docks where convoy ships once departed, it's difficult to imagine the scale of what occurred here. Thousands of ships, millions of tons of cargo, tens of thousands of lives. The ocean keeps its secrets well. Somewhere beneath the Atlantic waves lie the wrecks of hundreds of merchant ships, silent monuments to the men who crewed them. Some went down in minutes, their crews having no time even to broadcast a distress signal. Others sank slowly, giving men time to abandon ship, but not enough time for rescue to arrive. Each wreck is a time capsule, preserving a moment of tragedy, a story of courage cut short. The merchant sailors of World War II fought in a war without front lines, where every mile of ocean was potentially a battlefield. They had no training for combat, yet they faced enemy action as deadly as any soldier encountered. They had no weapons except the defensive guns bolted onto their ships, yet they sailed into waters where U-boats prowled. They had every reason to refuse such dangerous work, yet they sailed voyage after voyage, convoy after convoy, year after year. Their struggle was silent because the world paid little attention. Their courage was quiet because they were not seeking glory. But their contribution was absolutely essential. Without them, Britain falls. Without them, the liberation of Europe becomes impossible. Without them, the outcome of World War II could have been very different. Churchill was right to fear the Battle of the Atlantic. For over 5 years, Britain's survival hung by a thread woven from the determination of merchant sailors who refused to quit despite appalling casualties, brutal conditions, and minimal recognition. They were the convoy of courage, ordinary men performing extraordinary service, civilians who became heroes not through dramatic battlefield actions, but through the daily demonstration of incredible bravery. They sailed into the darkness knowing death might be waiting, and they kept sailing until the lights of peace finally burned bright again. We owe them not just gratitude, but remembrance. Their silent struggle ensured that freedom survived, and their story deserves to echo through history as loudly as any battle fought on land or in the air. The machinery of this silent struggle extended far beyond the ships themselves. In shipyards across North America and Britain, an industrial miracle was taking place that would prove as crucial as any military campaign. The Liberty ships, those unglamorous, mass-produced freighters, became the workhorses of the Atlantic convoys, and their story reveals the extraordinary scale of the Allied response to the U-boat threat. Before the war, building a cargo ship took months or even years. Skilled craftsmen carefully assembled each vessel using traditional shipbuilding techniques that had evolved over centuries. But Britain was losing ships faster than traditional methods could replace them. The solution came from American industrialist Henry Kaiser and a revolutionary approach to shipbuilding. Kaiser adapted automotive assembly line techniques to ship construction, prefabricating sections in factories far from the waterfront, then transporting these massive components to shipyards for rapid assembly. The result was the Liberty ship, a simple, sturdy freighter that could be built in weeks rather than months. At the peak of production, American shipyards launched Liberty ships at an almost unbelievable rate. The record was set in November 1942 when the SS Robert E. Peary was assembled in just 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. While this was a publicity stunt and not representative of average construction times, it demonstrated what focused industrial might could achieve. More typical was a construction time of about 45 days per ship. By war's end, American yards had produced over 2,700 Liberty ships, alongside hundreds of faster Victory ships and tankers. This industrial output meant that by 1943, Allied shipyards were finally building vessels faster than U-boats could sink them, a turning point as significant as any tactical victory at sea. But ships were only metal and machinery without the men to sail them. The recruitment and training of merchant crews became a massive undertaking. In Britain, the merchant navy had traditionally drawn from communities with long maritime traditions. Ports like Liverpool, Glasgow, Cardiff, Southampton, and Newcastle produced generation after generation of seafarers. But war created an insatiable demand for sailors that far exceeded the supply from traditional sources. Recruitment offices appeared in inland cities. Men who had never seen the ocean found themselves training for life at sea. The training was abbreviated out of necessity. A few weeks learning basic seamanship, firefighting, and lifeboat procedures, then straight onto a ship bound for danger. The diversity of convoy crews reflected the global nature of the struggle. A typical British merchant ship might have a white British captain and officers, Indian or Chinese sailors manning the deck crew, West African firemen and greasers working in the engine room, and perhaps Caribbean or West Indian crew members filling various roles. This racial and ethnic mixing, common in the peacetime merchant service, continued during the war. While prejudice and inequality certainly existed, non-white crew members often received lower pay and faced discrimination. The shared danger of convoy duty created bonds that transcended some of these divisions. When a torpedo struck, it killed without regard to race, nationality, or rank. In lifeboats adrift in the Atlantic, survival depended on cooperation, not skin color. The women of the merchant service deserve recognition in this story as well. While women didn't serve aboard the cargo ships themselves, they were integral to the convoy system. Female radio operators worked in coastal stations, maintaining contact with ships at sea and coordinating rescue efforts. Women worked in shipyards, building and repairing the vessels. Rosie the Riveter was as real in shipyards as in aircraft factories. Women served in the Women's Royal Naval Service, tracking convoys, plotting U-boat positions, and performing vital administrative work that kept the convoy system functioning. In ports, women worked as stevedores loading cargo, as canteen workers providing hospitality to sailors between voyages, and as volunteers with organizations that offered support to merchant seamen and their families. The ports themselves were transformed by the demands of convoy operations. Liverpool, the primary terminus for North Atlantic convoys, became one of the most strategically important locations in Britain. The city's docks worked around the clock, unloading ships as quickly as possible to get them turned around for another voyage. German bombers targeted Liverpool repeatedly, understanding that disrupting port operations would be as effective as sinking ships at sea. The May Blitz of 1941 devastated large sections of the city, killing nearly 4,000 civilians and destroying thousands of homes. Yet the docks continued functioning throughout the bombardment. Dock workers remained at their posts even as bombs fell around them, driven by the same stubborn determination that kept merchant sailors at sea. On the western side of the Atlantic, Halifax, Nova Scotia, became the primary assembly point for convoys. This Canadian port, with its excellent natural harbor and strategic location, processed thousands of ships during the war years. The city's population swelled with sailors, naval personnel, and dock workers. Convoy assembly was a complex choreographic exercise. Dozens of ships arriving from various ports had to be organized into columns, escorts assigned, sailing orders distributed, and weather conditions evaluated. The Bedford Basin, an anchorage within Halifax Harbor, would fill with merchant ships waiting for their convoy to form, a forest of masts and funnels representing nations from around the world, all bound together by common purpose. The life of a merchant sailor between voyages was shaped by the constant awareness that the next trip might be the last. Some men drank heavily in port, trying to forget the horrors they had witnessed and steel themselves for what was coming. Others sought out the company of family during every possible moment. Still others found solace in the camaraderie of other merchant seamen, gathering in merchant navy clubs and missions where they could be among men who understood what they had endured without need for explanation. These missions, operated by religious and charitable organizations, provided clean accommodations, meals, recreation facilities, and a refuge from the grimmer establishments that proliferated in port cities during wartime. The psychological toll of convoy duty was immense, though in that era it was rarely discussed or treated. Today, we would recognize many merchant sailors as suffering from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Men who had watched their ships sink, who had seen friends die, who had spent days or weeks adrift believing they would never be rescued, carried those experiences with them forever. Nightmares plagued many veterans for the rest of their lives. Some suffered survivor guilt, tormented by the question of why they had lived when so many others had died. The sound of a sudden loud noise could trigger panic attacks decades after the war ended. But in the 1940s, such psychological wounds were dismissed as weakness or cowardice. Men were expected to simply carry on, and most did, suffering in silence. The technical evolution of both the hunters and the hunted added layers of complexity to the Atlantic struggle. As the war progressed, U-boats became more sophisticated. The introduction of the schnorkel, a breathing tube that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged, made them harder to detect. Acoustic torpedoes that homed in on propeller noise increased the danger to escort vessels. New U-boat designs promised even greater underwater speed and endurance, though most arrived too late to affect the war's outcome. The Allies responded with their own technological innovations. High-frequency direction finding, nicknamed HFDUF, allowed escort ships to pinpoint U-boat radio transmissions and prosecute attacks before submarines could strike. Improved depth charges with more sophisticated fusing patterns could destroy submarines at greater depths. The Hedgehog weapon, which threw 24 small bombs in a circular pattern ahead of the attacking ship, allowed escorts to maintain sonar contact while attacking, unlike conventional depth charges which had to be dropped directly over a submarine, causing the attacking ship to lose sonar contact at the crucial moment. Centimetric radar, operating on wavelengths that German submarines couldn't detect, allowed escorts to find surfaced U-boats on the darkest nights. Perhaps most important was the closing of the Atlantic Gap, that vast stretch of ocean in mid-Atlantic where land-based aircraft couldn't reach. For years, U-boats could operate in this area with relative impunity, knowing that aerial attack was impossible. The introduction of very long-range B-24 Liberator bombers and, crucially, escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant ship hulls, finally extended air cover across the entire Atlantic. U-boats could no longer surface to recharge batteries and make high-speed runs on convoys without risking attack from the air. This development, more than any other single factor, sealed the fate of the German submarine campaign. The human intelligence war also played a crucial role. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park worked tirelessly to crack German naval Enigma codes. When they succeeded, the intelligence gained, codenamed Ultra, allowed convoy routing authorities to steer convoys away from known U-boat concentrations. The Germans never learned that their codes had been broken, attributing convoy evasions to improved radar and patrol aircraft. Conversely, German intelligence services achieved their own successes, with spies reporting Allied shipping movements and U-boat agents occasionally providing information that led to successful attacks. This shadow war of codes and intelligence, invisible to the merchant sailors themselves, significantly influenced their survival chances. The experience of being torpedoed varied tremendously depending on circumstances. Some ships, struck in the right location, sank in less than a minute. The crew of such vessels had virtually no chance of survival. They went down with their ship before they even fully understood what was happening. Other vessels, particularly those with well-trained crews and favorable damage, might stay afloat for hours, giving men time to abandon ship in an orderly fashion and await rescue. The condition of the sea made an enormous difference. Launching lifeboats in calm weather was straightforward. Doing so in a North Atlantic gale with 40-foot waves was extraordinarily dangerous and often impossible. The composition of a ship's cargo also determined survival outcomes. Ships carrying bulk grain often stayed afloat longer because the grain absorbed water and provided buoyancy. Vessels loaded with iron ore or other heavy cargo sank rapidly. The most horrific fate awaited crews of tankers loaded with petroleum or fuel oil. When a torpedo struck such a ship, the fuel often ignited, creating an inferno on the water. Men who jumped overboard to escape the sinking ship found themselves swimming through burning oil. Many survivors of tanker sinkings bore terrible burn scars for the rest of their lives. The psychological trauma of watching shipmates burn to death, hearing their screams, smelling the awful stench of burning flesh, these memories haunted survivors forever. Rescue operations themselves demonstrated both the best and worst of wartime exigencies. Escort commanders faced terrible dilemmas when merchant ships were hit. Should they stop to pick up survivors, making their own ships vulnerable to the U-boat that had just attacked? Should they pursue the submarine, leaving merchant sailors in the water? Doctrine generally dictated that escorts should pursue and destroy the U-boat while other merchant ships in the convoy attempted rescues when possible. But reality was often more complex. Compassionate escort captains sometimes risked their ships and crews to save merchant sailors. Other times, the imperatives of protecting the remaining convoy meant sailing past men in the water, leaving them to almost certain death. No one who made such decisions found them easy, and many carried the guilt of these choices for the rest of their lives. Rescue ships, designated merchant vessels equipped with extra medical facilities and berths for survivors, accompanied many convoys specifically to handle rescue operations. These vessels could stop to pick up survivors, while escorts dealt with submarine threats. But rescue ships themselves were vulnerable targets, and several were sunk, creating the tragic irony of survivors being torpedoed twice in the same convoy. The men who crewed rescue ships displayed a particular kind of courage, sailing in convoys knowing that their duty would be to stop and become a stationary target whenever other ships were hit. The weather, that constant adversary, killed as surely as torpedoes. Winter storms in the North Atlantic generated conditions that tested the limits of ship design and human endurance. Waves 60 or 70 feet high crashed over vessels, carrying away deck cargo, lifeboats, and sometimes men. Ships could be damaged so severely by storms that they had to be abandoned, becoming casualties without enemy action. Men working on exposed decks risked being washed overboard with every wave. The cold was so intense that seawater freezing on deck created layers of ice inches thick, making every surface treacherous and adding dangerous weight to ships. Crew members assigned to gun watches on open-deck mounts endured particularly brutal conditions, standing 4-hour watches in sub-zero temperatures, with wind chill making conditions even worse. The Russian convoys, those terrible Arctic passages, represented the extreme limit of what could be asked of merchant sailors. The strategic necessity was clear. The Soviet Union desperately needed Allied military equipment to survive the German onslaught, and the Arctic route was the most direct supply line. But the costs were appalling. Beyond the usual U-boat threat, convoys to Murmansk faced attack from German aircraft, surface ships, and some of the worst weather on Earth. The summer midnight sun meant constant daylight, allowing German reconnaissance aircraft to shadow convoys continuously and direct bombing attacks. Stukas dive-bombed merchant ships, while high-level bombers carpet-bombed convoy formations. The German battleship Tirpitz and heavy cruisers threatened from Norwegian fjords, forcing convoys to maintain strong surface escorts that were needed elsewhere. Convoy PQ-17's disaster in July 1942 illustrated the catastrophic consequences of faulty intelligence and poor command decisions. When British intelligence mistakenly believed Tirpitz was sortying to attack the convoy, the First Sea Lord ordered the convoy to scatter and escorts to withdrawal. Individual merchant ships were left to fend for themselves against concentrated German air and submarine attacks. Over the next week, German forces hunted down and destroyed 2/3 of the convoy. Beyond the terrible loss of life and ships, the political ramifications were severe. Stalin accused the Allies of deliberately withholding aid, and the tragedy strained the alliance at a critical time. For the merchant sailors who survived, scattering represented the ultimate betrayal. Stripped of the protection that made the convoy system work, left alone to die. Yet even after PQ-17, merchant sailors continued sailing the Arctic route. Subsequent convoys were better protected and more successful, but the dangers never diminished. Convoy PQ-18 in September 1942 fought through repeated air attacks, with escort carriers providing fighter cover. 10 merchant ships were sunk, but 27 got through, a ratio that was considered a success given the intensity of German attacks. The courage required to sign on to a Russian convoy after knowing what had happened to previous convoys is difficult